The Harper family had a cherished tradition. Every Christmas, they added a new ornament to their tree. Each decoration was tied to a memory: a ceramic snowman from a ski trip, a glittery angel from their first Christmas as a married couple, and tiny hand-painted wooden ornaments made by their children. Over the years, their tree became a symbol of their family's history. This year, however, would be different. At a small antique shop on the edge of town, Sarah Harper was drawn to a curious ornament. It was a tiny wooden house, no larger than her palm, with intricate carvings of snowy shingles and frosted windows. But it was the painted face in one of the windows that caught her attention, a small, pale figure staring out with an expression that seemed to change depending on how she held it. She chalked it up to clever craftsmanship and bought it, thinking it would make the perfect addition to their tree. Back home, the family gathered to decorate. The kids fought over who would place the new ornament, but Sarah insisted it go on the highest branch, where it could be admired. As she hung it, a chill ran down her spine. The face in the window seemed to frown for just a moment before returning to its blank, indifferent stare. She shook it off and joined the others, admiring their handiwork. That night, as the family slept, faint creaking sounds came from the living room. The ornaments on the tree swayed gently, though there was no draft. The twinkling lights cast strange shadows on the walls, and the new ornaments seemed to glow faintly. By morning, the youngest Harper, 6-year-old Ben, was missing. His bed was empty, and his favorite toy car lay abandoned beneath the tree. The family searched the house, calling his name, but he was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as they called the police. Officers scoured the neighborhood but found no sign of Ben. That evening, as Sarah sat by the tree, trying to comfort her other children, her eyes drifted to the new ornament. She froze. The face in the window no longer looked like the generic figure she had seen at the shop. It was unmistakably Ben's face, his expression twisted in terror. She screamed, but her husband dismissed it as grief playing tricks on her. "It's just an ornament," he said, though he avoided looking directly at it. Sarah tried to take the ornament off the tree, but the branch seemed to resist, twisting and curling around it like a hand refusing to let go. Desperate, she tried to smash it, but the tiny house was unyielding, as if made of iron instead of wood. The next night, it was Sarah's husband, Tom, who disappeared. He had stayed up late, sitting by the tree, keeping watch with a baseball bat. In the morning, the bat lay on the floor, and Tom was gone. The ornament's window now held two figures, Ben's face and Tom's, both staring out with wide, horrified eyes. The house felt darker, colder. The remaining family members huddled together, too afraid to sleep. By Christmas Eve, only Sarah and her eldest daughter, Emily, remained. Emily begged her mother to leave the house, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to abandon the tree. "It won't matter where we go," Sarah whispered. "It'll follow us." That night, Emily vanished. Sarah didn't even hear her scream. When she looked at the ornament, Emily's face had joined the others, her eyes filled with sorrow. Alone and desperate, Sarah tried everything she could think of to destroy the ornament. She hurled it into the fireplace, but the flames recoiled, refusing to touch it. She buried it in the snow outside, but when she returned to the living room, there it was, hanging on the highest branch. She even tried sawing down the tree, but the blade broke on the first cut. As midnight approached, the lights on the tree began to flicker, and the air grew heavy. Sarah sat in front of the ornament, staring at the faces of her family. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, the figures inside the ornament moved. Their tiny mouths opened, but no sound came out. Instead, Sarah heard a voice behind her, deep and ancient. "They're mine now," it said. "And soon, you will be too." She turned, but there was nothing there. The tree began to shake violently, the ornaments clinking together like a macabre symphony. The branches reached out, wrapping around Sarah's arms and legs, pulling her toward the tree. She struggled, screaming, but the branches were too strong. The last thing she saw was the ornament glowing brightly, its window empty and waiting. When the Harper house was finally investigated, it was empty. The tree stood in the center of the living room, pristine and untouched, with a single ornament at its top. A tiny wooden house. Inside its window were four tiny faces, forever trapped, their expressions frozen in silent despair. The house was sold a few months later, and the ornament went with it, waiting patiently for its next family. Ellie adored Christmas. At 7 years old, she counted down the days with boundless excitement, leaving cookies and milk for Santa and carrots for the reindeer. But this year, Ellie had begun seeing something unusual. It started as a shadow flickering in her peripheral vision. Then she began describing it in unsettling detail. Santa's shadow, she called it, a dark, monstrous version of Santa Claus with hollow black eyes and long, clawed fingers. Her parents brushed it off. "You've been watching too many Christmas movies," her dad said with a chuckle. "Or maybe you're imagining things because you're so excited." But Ellie insisted. She said Santa's shadow stood in the corners of her room at night, watching her, and that it whispered things she couldn't understand. On Christmas Eve, Ellie begged her parents to let her sleep in their room. "He's coming for me tonight," she said, clutching her teddy bear. Her mother reassured her, tucked her into bed, and promised that Santa only brought joy, not fear. That night, her parents were jolted awake by a loud crash. They ran to Ellie's room, only to find it empty. Her bed was neatly made, her stuffed bear sitting on the pillow, and the window was wide open, though there were no footprints in the snow below. The only clue was a single soot-stained footprint on the windowsill and a piece of crumpled paper on the floor. It read, in childlike handwriting, "He sees you when you're sleeping." The parents frantically searched the house, calling Ellie's name. In the living room, the cookies and milk were untouched, but the carrot was snapped in half. The fireplace, strangely, was cold, though there were faint, fresh claw marks on the bricks. They called the police, but no trace of Ellie could be found. As the hours passed, the house grew unnaturally cold. At midnight, the parents heard a faint jingling from the roof, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. They rushed outside into the snow, where they looked up and froze in terror. Above them, silhouetted against the moon, was a grotesque sleigh pulled by skeletal reindeer with glowing red eyes. The sleigh was a tangle of dark, gnarled wood, and in the driver's seat sat a figure cloaked in shadows. Its torn red robes fluttered in the wind, revealing hands like claws gripping the reins. Where its face should have been was a swirling black void, but they could feel its gaze piercing through them. "Ellie," her father shouted, but the shadow only tilted its head, as though mocking him. Then, from the back of the sleigh, they saw her, Ellie, sitting motionless, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She clutched her teddy bear, but she didn't move, didn't cry out. Her mother fell to her knees, sobbing. "Please, give her back," she screamed. The shadow's mouth opened, revealing sharp, glinting teeth. Its voice was a low, guttural growl. "She's mine now," it said, "but don't worry. I'll come back for you next year." With that, the sleigh rose higher into the sky, disappearing into the darkness. The jingling of bells faded, leaving only silence. The parents stood there in the snow, helpless, as their daughter was taken into the night. But the horror didn't end there. In the days that followed, the parents tried to explain Ellie's disappearance to the police, but no one believed them. They were left alone with their grief in the now silent house. Then, strange things began happening. At first, it was small, faint jingling sounds at odd hours, soot appearing on the walls. But soon, they began finding crumpled pieces of paper scattered throughout the house. Each one bore the same childlike handwriting, "He sees you when you're sleeping." A week after Christmas, the mother woke up in the middle of the night to find Ellie's teddy bear sitting on the edge of her bed. She screamed, waking her husband, who found a trail of sooty footprints leading from the fireplace to their bedroom. As the next Christmas approached, the parents became increasingly paranoid. They boarded up the windows, sealed the chimney, and refused to put up any decorations. But on Christmas Eve, the air grew cold again. The lights flickered, and the sound of jingling bells echoed through the house. At midnight, the shadow returned. This time, it didn't come for a child. The parents were found days later, lifeless but untouched, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The only sign of the intruder was a soot-stained note left on the mantelpiece. It read, "He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. And now, you'll join her." Some say the shadow still roams on Christmas Eve, seeking families who have lost their holiday spirit. Others believe it only comes for those who see it, drawn to the fear it inspires. But one thing is certain, if you ever see Santa's shadow, it's already too late. The small, snowy town of Millhaven was known for its festive Christmas spirit. Every year, groups of carolers wandered the streets, singing songs of joy and peace. It was a cherished tradition. But this year, something was off. On a frosty December evening, Emma Parsons heard a knock at her door. Her husband was away, and her children, Lily and Max, were playing in the living room. When Emma opened the door, she found a group of carolers standing on her porch. They were dressed in Victorian-style clothing, their faces obscured by shadow. They began to sing, but their voices were strangely hollow, and the melody was unlike any carol Emma had ever heard. When the song ended, the tallest caroler extended a withered holly branch toward her. Confused but not wanting to be rude, Emma accepted it. The group turned and walked away without another word. That night, Emma woke to faint singing, though the house was silent. The holly branch, which she'd left in the kitchen, was now on her bedroom dresser. The next evening, other neighbors reported strange encounters with the same carolers. Their songs unsettled everyone who heard them, and each family was left with an identical holly branch. Soon, the festive spirit of Millhaven dimmed. People began locking their doors, and the once bustling streets fell silent. On Christmas Eve, Emma tucked her children into bed early, trying to shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. At midnight, the knocking returned. This time, it was louder, more forceful. Emma ignored it, clutching a fire poker as the sound moved to the windows. The singing began again, louder now, with lyrics she could finally make out. Come to the cold, come to the night, join the shadows, leave the light. The lights in her home flickered, then went out. Emma rushed to her children's room, but the beds were empty. Panicked, she ran outside, where the carolers stood in a circle under the pale moonlight. At the center of the circle was a shadowy figure, tall and indistinct, its form shifting like smoke. Emma screamed for her children, but the figure only extended a clawed hand toward her. The carolers began to hum, their blank faces staring. Then, as if a gust of wind had swept through, they were gone. The snow where they had stood was undisturbed, but faint whispers lingered in the air. By morning, Emma was alone. The holly branch on her mantle glistened unnaturally, its crimson berries vibrant against the cold, gray dawn. The townspeople had vanished, and the streets were eerily quiet. Some say that on Christmas Eve, if you pass through Millhaven, you can still hear faint singing in the distance. But if you stop to listen, you'll never be seen again.